and welcome to the Mind Matters, a Head Teacher and a Psychologist podcast. My name is Hannah Albery. I will be your co-host alongside my very dear colleague, Kate Margarson. This week we have the pleasure of the company of Dr Karen Bateson. Karen is currently Head of Clinical Strategy and Development for the Parent Infant Foundation. And this episode comes to you at the beginning of Infant Mental Health Awareness Week. So if you want to know more, Infant Mental Health Awareness Week is all around encouraging us to see and think about the experiences of babies and how these influence their mental health and development going forwards. So that's what we'll be talking about today. If you want to know more, you can visit parentinfantfoundation.org.uk. You can also find them on Twitter. And this week they are using the hashtag IMHAW20 and hashtag first 1001 days. So Karen is a very, very knowledgeable lady. She's a clinical child psychologist by background and has had a 20-year career in the NHS CAMS service before moving to the NSPCC to develop prevention of child maltreatment services. She's lectured and trained around the UK and has published articles on parenting, the importance of father-inclusive practice, and the antenatal relationship and ACEs. So it's a fascinating one this week, and something that is really very important in a really important week. So enjoy, guys.
Hi everyone, and welcome to another episode of Mind Matters. Today we are joined by Dr Karen Bateson. So good afternoon to you, Karen.
Hi, thank you for having me.
It's so lovely to have you and your expertise with us this afternoon.
So first of all, I think we need to say a big thank you to Karen because you have been really instrumental in our journey around relationally informed practice. And you've had some involvement in shaping that and kind of supporting us as a school. So thank you very much. But I wondered if we could start with learning a little bit about your current role and how you started working in this kind of relationally informed way.
Oh, thanks, Kate. It really surprised me when you said that about me being helpful to you on your journey, because I think really you were already on the right track. I feel like I just did a bit of cheerleading really and said, keep going, you're on the right track, keep going. In terms of me getting here, I think when I did my psychology training, I was just really lucky because I did my older adult placement first, and then my adult placement, and then my child placement. So it was just a brilliant kind of learning experience in that kind of tree of life being rooted in childhood. So the older adults that I'd worked with, it seemed to me that their psychological turmoil had been related to unresolved stuff during adulthood, and that adult stuff had been usually, not always, but very often rooted in an experience of childhood adversity and trauma. So I kind of spent most of my career thinking, if only we could get in there earlier. And that directed the jobs I took and where I moved on to until I found myself at the Parent Infant Foundation. Having said that, I still very firmly believe that there's loads of opportunities to help people throughout the life course. It's just that for me, particularly with trauma and adversity, it just seems to make sense. Prevention and early intervention seem to make sense. So the job I do now is supporting others to deliver parent-infant relationship therapies.
That sounds fascinating. And it really resonates with me around, I worked across a range of different areas in mental health and then kept coming back to, why am I kind of coming in at this point when this needed to have been done earlier?
Yeah, I think that's a common experience actually. And for people who work in children's services, I think over the last 20 years, there's been a growing acknowledgement that even though we can, of course, help older teenagers, if we can get in there younger, it feels like we've got a chance to prevent distress.
I can't remember who it was that said it, but it's that point, isn't it, that Where do you stop taking the bodies out of the river and start finding where they fell in? I think that we often, whenever we talk, Kate, it always kind of brings us back to that. So it really resonates with what we're about and our plans going forward, that I totally affirm exactly what you're saying, that there is more that we can do earlier on.
So with that in mind, Karen, let's talk about the importance of early parenting. So early parenting experiences and the relationship with the neurobiological development of children, and how professionals can develop that without blame and shame.
Okay. I mean, I guess I come from a position where I don't feel there's any place at all for blame or shame in therapeutic work or work with children and families. We know biologically that they inhibit healing and learning, and psychologically that the patterns of parenting, they tend to be, at least in part, responses to how a parent was parented themselves. So I think we need to have a huge amount of compassion in our therapeutic approaches, but self-compassion as well. Actually, the vast majority of parents are just trying to do the very best they can for every child they have, but I guess sometimes past traumas or current stresses get in the way, and those things take up the emotional headspace that the parent needs in order to form a sensitive and responsive relationship with a child. And actually that's true of all of us, you know, that's true of, you know, professionals and, you know, everybody who works in a school, for example. You know, when you're having a tough day yourself, that uses up some of your emotional resource, and that's the space that you would use for sensitive and responsive relationships with children. So looking after staff's really important as well in this. But I think in terms of early parenting, those first 1001 days, so from conception onwards, those early years are such an important time for brain development. That's when we're laying down the foundations of emotional regulation, and so many of the things that underpin later life outcomes, that it's really important that we do our utmost to support parents to get on track, get a good relationship with their baby. And I think if that goes wrong, if a relationship does fall off track, we need to act really quite quickly, because that's when it's left unsupported, those patterns, those unhelpful patterns of interaction become distressing, certainly to the baby, sometimes also to the parent, and those patterns of distress can over time turn into disorder, and that's when we're starting to probably need some specialist help to unpick and get the relationship back on track. And it's important because it's not just mental health, it's not just later mental health that underpins. There's, you know, speech and language outcomes, how kids do in school, how they form relationships, their social skills, even things like, you know, antisocial behaviour. We know that those first years are really important in laying down the foundations of all those later outcomes. And so it frustrates me, because I think we just forget, I don't know, we just seem to forget babies somehow. They just seem to fall off our radar, and, you know, they can't tell us that things aren't okay for us. So we've got to be good at reading their behaviour. We've got to get better at understanding what the difference is between the normal signals of distress that a baby would use, you know, crying to let us know that they're hungry or they're tired or whatever, and those behavioural kind of communications that are telling us actually things aren't okay at all for this baby and we need to help. So I guess what I'm saying is we need to make it easy. We need to make it safe, psychologically safe for parents to reach out when they feel like something's not going okay. And also we need to get better at understanding what babies are trying to communicate to us without words.
I found that really interesting when you've just said about the parenting journey starts at conception. So I wonder what messages you get from conception around parenting, because that was a bit of a light bulb moment for me, and I work in this. So I wonder at what point do we start sharing that message that parenting is so early on in this journey, it's right from the beginning. And I wonder which kind of professionals would be involved in that, because as you say, we get those messages out there very early on. It could be a whole range of professionals who are having a very kind of gentle influence of this message.
Yeah, I mean, I'm a strong believer in the circle of life, that there's an intergenerational heritage, you know, that we pass down from generation to generation, ideas and cultures around parenting. And so although we think about ourselves as parents, once we find out we're going to be a parent, actually our journey into parenthood, our transition into parenthood started when we were in the womb, actually, and generations back. And that's why I think there's always an opportunity to intervene. You know, it's never too late. And for you guys in school, you know, you're raising your reception intake this year, that's the next generation of parents. So, you know, there's always an opportunity to think about how we interrupt patterns of relating that are unhelpful or could be unhelpful. But yeah, I think the whole idea of messaging around this, so the idea that babies aren't just little bundles of joy that don't remember anything, and you know, they don't communicate distress. I think we need a whole sea change really in society at all levels about understanding that actually that's been disproven now. There's neuroscience from the last 20 years, in fact longer than that, huge amounts of research which show us that babies are very sensitive to their environment from conception onwards.
So it makes me think about the amount of conversations I have with parents at school, but also my own friends and family when they say things like, well, that happened when they were a baby, so they won't remember. And it also makes me think about when Karen Traceman talks about the first classroom is the womb. What do you make of that idea, and what impact does that have preparing for school?
I think that's typically brilliant of Karen, isn't it? I love the way that she can take really complex science and make it so accessible and put it across in such a kind of meaningful way. I totally agree with her. I guess what I take from that is that the baby is learning about the world even in the womb, and there's really clear evidence that that happens. It happens at a biological level and at a psychological level. So biologically, the baby's nervous system is monitoring the levels of biochemicals in the mum's body, so that the baby themselves can calibrate their stress response systems. And I just think that's such a good example of how clever nature is, because if mum is living in a stressful environment, that helps baby to come out kind of hyper alert, you know, and ready, that their body is physically ready to handle higher levels of stress. And we can see that in metabolism, changes in metabolism as well. And psychologically, we know that when babies can hear, so they start to be able to hear it around the beginning of the third trimester, and one of the functions of that is to help the baby recognize familiar voices, so that when the baby's born, they can match the sound of the voice to the face, so that they can kind of zoom in on their attachment figure. So there's all these different ways in which the baby's learning and adjusting to their environment, even though they're in the womb. And so that's why we talk about the first 1,001 days from conception. Now, you know, it's not the first 1,001 days after birth, it's from conception as well. And it's just so important. And in terms of preparing for school, I mean, I think the learning that the child makes in those first 1001 days does lay the foundation. Having said that, we shouldn't be too fatalistic about that. So there's a lot that can happen between birth and the child's first day at school, and there's a lot that can go well. So even babies where maybe mum's had a really significant mental health difficulty during pregnancy, you know, even though that baby has been exposed to the biochemical experience of that, it doesn't mean that that baby's going to be harmed for the rest of their life or anything like that. I think when parents see that kind of science being communicated in the media, you know, it's quite worrying. I think we need to see this in terms of risk, so it increases the risk a little bit, but we can get back on track with the right kind of support. And what that means, the right kind of support, it means supporting parents and babies to get into a secure and nurturing relationship that's characterized by healthy interaction. So yeah.
And you just started to touch on kind of stress, the experience of stress both in the womb and following birth. I wondered if now would be a good opportunity for us to talk about what adversity means to you and what that might look like in the community that you serve.
Sure. Well, I guess in this context, adversity means that babies' communications aren't being received or understood, or maybe responded to in a particularly sensitive way, and that kind of falling out of tune with each other happens in all healthy relationships actually, but when it becomes the predominant way of interacting between parent and child, that's when things can start to get quite adverse for the child. And if it's significant, that's when it can start to become quite harmful. And I guess that parents have sometimes experienced really significant traumas themselves, and they just can't think about the baby having feelings or they can't think about the baby's needs separately, and sometimes they can't think about the baby having their own mind, and that's when things can get really quite harmful. So in terms of adversity, it's that distortion in the parent-child interaction that we're constantly kind of looking out for so that we can support parents. And of course that type of interaction can also be occurring with other adversities, other types of adversity like domestic abuse or you know, physical abuse and that kind of thing. So we need everybody who sees babies, so GPs, midwives, health visitors, social workers, early years workers, everybody who would see babies, we need them to be looking very carefully at what the baby's communicating with their cues and behaviour. You know, is the baby seeking out interaction? Does that interaction at a gut level, does it feel comfortable when we observe it? Over time, you know, does there seem to be a pattern developing, a healthy pattern of interaction developing? So yeah, I would definitely kind of want everybody to know a bit more about how babies communicate.
I think the communication of distress is something that I guess we need to be a little bit more alert of what that looks like in babies. Yeah, and you know, it's both skilled work but also not terribly difficult, if that makes sense. I think there's some really brilliant kind of interventions and training courses out there that help people just think about the natural serve and return interactions that happen between babies and adults, and what to look out for when that's going wrong more times than not, and also to look out for kind of babies who might avoid face-to-face contact, or they might really find it hard to settle. And it isn't necessarily the relationship that's causing a baby to be unsettled, but I think a sensitive observer can see
over time whether that nice kind of rhythmical cyclical interaction is present as often as it isn't present, if that makes sense.
I start thinking about the impact that then, so if a baby is born and those needs are not met, and those needs continue to be unmet and they're not intervened with, what might that then look like when they come to school? What might we see? Generally speaking, I mean, you know,
that's a great question. That's a really good question. So it really depends on the child's experience of relationships. So it could be that a child has needed to become really overactive to get into a relationship or get into interaction with an adult at home. So that's not uncommon, where one or more parents might be very severely depressed. And so the child has to kind of exaggerate their approach responses to kind of activate the interaction. And so where that becomes the child's predominant way of getting their needs met, when they come into school, they might be perceived as children who are, in the old-fashioned language, attention seeking. And of course, it's what they've learned as a coping strategy to get their needs met at home is now becoming maladaptive in the school environment. And then, you know, sometimes you'll see that kind of leads to a chain reaction of intervention in school. And then other times, so for example, if a parent is a risk to the child, or the child doesn't feel safe in the home, they'll get into a pattern of keeping quiet, suppressing their needs, suppressing their communication. And over the preschool years, that will become, that will kind of lead to a child seeming quite quiet, quite withdrawn, not necessarily reaching out socially to peers and to teachers, and maybe quite frightened at times, quite anxious at times. So it really, the presentation in school will really depend on what coping styles the child has had to adopt to get their needs met earlier. So it's different, it's a mixed picture, I would say. I think what's always true is that there's always a story, and behaviour is always a communication. So what's important is that the staff in school are alert to that message that the child's using their behaviour to communicate.
And that's a phrase that's used often, isn't it? Behaviour is communication. We, you know, it's what we kind of live by at school, in our school particularly. But it just really makes me think that a lot of the time when we see these behaviours, or I hear other professionals talk about those kind of behaviours that we see in school sometimes, that there is so much more to the picture, and there is no kind of hard and quick intervention. We can't just give them a group and they're fixed, you know? It's about how we look at that more systemic view of parenting and how we do that more holistic family work, which is where I believe, from doing this, you know, kind of work, not as long as either of you two, it just, my gut reaction tells me that there's more that we could do on a family level. Does that make sense?
It absolutely makes great sense, because, you know, often the family are doing their best, their parents are doing their best, and they don't quite understand either why the child isn't thriving. And so I think it's so important to get that psychological safety right, not just for the child but for the parents. So how you as school staff interact with parents is absolutely the kind of bedrock of you being able to meet the child's needs.
And I say this every single time, I'm going to get this on a t-shirt,
it comes back to relationships, doesn't it? And that's not just with the child, it's us, how we create that safety and develop that relationship with parent as caregiver. So linking back to what we said earlier, you can do that kind of work with a parent that's not blame or shame, because it's authentic in your relationship with them.
And it links really nicely with my next question, which was around, what does relationship-based practice look like in your work?
Okay, so I'm not in a clinical role anymore, but that doesn't necessarily mean that relationship-based work kind of stops there. We know that trauma and adversity are overrepresented in the helping professions. So for me, I always assume that I'm probably close to somebody who's experienced childhood trauma and adversity. So, you know, there is just some golden rules about how we treat one another, you know, with kindness, with compassion. For me, an absolute no-no is raised voices. You know, for me, it's completely unacceptable to have raised voices at work and actually at school as well. And I think what you're trying to achieve in early years and school setting is really fundamentally based on the idea that when you're working in a relationship-based way and a trauma-informed way, you're always, whether you know somebody's had trauma or not, you're always working in a way that would not trigger trauma or feelings of a lack of safety, so feeling psychologically unsafe in your environment. I think in terms of the teams, the parent-infant teams that we support, I listen to them with great respect, because they really think carefully about their relationship-based practice. So for example, I know that one of the teams recently has amended their referral form to include the referrer's voice and the parent's voice, but now also the infant's voice. And I think that speaks absolute volumes to the respect for everybody and care for everybody. And it's just getting the basics right. It's how we speak to one another, it's how we word our letters, you know, it's how we are totally honest with people and we focus on feelings, and we do that with respect. So I know that sounds really, really obvious, and lots of people will be thinking, yeah, we do that anyway. But actually, when you work in a high pressure environment, schools, CAMS, social care, when you're working with people in distress, as a member of staff, you are in receipt of a lot of powerful feelings around pain and abuse. And actually it takes a really a big heart and a capacity for self-regulation to be able to not let those feelings of pain kind of leak back into the work. So for me, relationship-based practice means very careful thought to staff welfare and staff well-being. So for me, it's not just about us having relationships with each other and with the families, it's about how the system and the organisation looks after its staff as well. Does that make sense?
Yeah, just like when you were talking about understanding the stories that families have and the experiences, that's the same for our staff. They bring their own stories and experiences, and we need to be just as mindful around those experiences as we are with our children.
Yes, I totally agree.
So just going back, Karen, to when you were talking about how one of your practitioners has adapted a form to kind of capture the voice of the infant, how do we promote the voice of those children who fall out of the remit of education but will very soon be part of it? Often infants are missed in our work, yet babies should be present on our radar because they are our future.
I think it's a great question, and to be honest, when we examine the extent to which babies fall off our radar, I find myself continually shocked. So things like 42% of CCGs don't have a provision for children under 2 that need specialist relationship support. 42%. And of those that do, they actually don't see many under 2s in some of those areas. So the vast majority of babies in this country don't yet have access to relationship support when they need it. And at a very basic level, age is a protected characteristic. On the Equalities Act, we would not put up with that kind of discrimination if it was based on race or gender. So I think it's curious the extent to which babies fall off the radar. And it's not just policy, it's not just decision making, it's practice as well. And I guess, you know, babies can't shout, they don't vote. You need to understand how to translate their communication. It's not quite a foreign language, but it's a slightly different language that they communicate in. So I think for me, I would just like everybody to build into their thinking, where is the baby in this? Where's the baby? And if anybody is doing anything at all about children, not necessarily even just children's mental health, but children, and babies are not mentioned, they need to stop and start again. Because we know that the first 1,001 days are a major determinant of many other life outcomes. So if we're forgetting about babies, we're missing a massive trick. And I think that's a humanitarian issue, but it's also an economic issue. I think it's both. So it kind of, the answer to your question is, we just need to remind ourselves to think about babies in every way, in everything we do, a bit more.
And if you think about the current mental health crisis that this country finds itself in, correlated with then the fact that we're not intervening with babies early enough, seems to me that that's where the problem lies. That's where we should be putting the resource, that's where we should be putting the money, that's where we should be putting the support. It just seems balmy that we're not.
Well, we've talked about this in terms of school, haven't we, all three of us together, that we often will get children who present in school with very distressed behaviour age 3, and the traditional view is they'll grow out of it, and the behaviourist model that a school might use will teach them how to behave. That idea that behaviour is communication can sometimes be totally neglected. Obviously that's not the case in our school, and then it only then becomes an issue that requires our attention and intervention when the child reaches key stage 2, because they are usually externalizing in a way that makes them and other people unsafe, and staff are now scared. If we know that babies are being missed, we need to track back a little bit and see what earlier intervention we can put in place.
Yeah.
So with that in mind, what can we do to support and promote parental attachment?
So just going back to the mental health issue, increasingly I'm thinking about it like a domino fall. It's not the perfect metaphor, but it makes some important points. So you remember those domino falls, they can, you know, you knock over one domino at the beginning and it can branch off into all different kinds of outcomes. So what we need to remember is you can stop a domino fall at any point, and equally you can start the domino fall at any point. So I think part of the current mental health crisis is related to factors around the pressure children are under, partly through schools, you know, the need to achieve, the need for schools to achieve through an Ofsted framework. I'm not massively negative about screen use, but I think there are some aspects of social media that can become very damaging. And also just, I think the wider culture of pressure, particularly kind of pressure to achieve and pressure to look and be a certain way, is kind of contributing. And it comes at a time when actually CAMHS has been under financial pressure for many years. So we've got a lack of capacity. You know, I'm absolutely not knocking CAMHS staff I mean, I worked in CAMS for 20 years, I know how hard they work, but you've got the lack of capacity plus a real kind of upsurge in need. But in terms of where babies fit into that, I think we'll never prevent older children needing a mental health service. You know, we'll never get rid of CAMS. It will never be the case that even if we kind of supported every single child under 3, that we'd never need a mental health service. But what the evidence suggests is for every £1 we invest before the age of 3, we save 9 later on. So in terms of, you know, reducing the burden on CAMS, reducing the burden on the looked after system, reducing the burden on specialist support services in education, it just makes sense for so many different ways to do things earlier, to get involved earlier. And in terms of supporting kind of attachment, and particularly during pregnancy, there's loads of ways we can do that. The effective ways tend to focus on helping parents to generate positive images of the baby in the womb. So reflections about what the child might be like in personality, what they might look like, what their needs might be, what their feelings might be, what kind of experience it will be to be a parent. Now, I don't mean those kind of mother care, saccharine kind of pictures of it all being beautiful and lovely, because that doesn't match the reality of having a new baby. It doesn't match up with baby sick and sleepless nights and all of that stuff. But I do mean helping parents to create even a neutral or positive space for that new person to come into. And it's not uncommon for parents to have negative expectations of their baby. Often those negative expectations relate to the parent's own past experiences, sometimes referred to as ghosts in the nursery. And it's important we don't close those down, because they need to be thought about. They need to find a safe space to be articulated and be thought about and be processed and put in a separate place, kind of kept from the positive or neutral space that we're keeping for the new baby to come into. And when interventions manage to achieve that, actually things can get off to a better start.
It's that phrase when we visited America, Jerry, who ran Lakeside, introduced us to the phrase that your loyalty are legacies. And we know that lots of our families can experience loyalty to their legacies. So how can we support those families to forge their own path and develop relationships that are actually co-regulating?
Well, I think that's quite a difficult question. I think it's right. We are loyal to our legacies. The key is insight. So we need to work in a supportive and strengths-based way, respectful way, to help parents understand that they were gifted their legacy by others, and that their legacy will have had probably some good sides, some good aspects, and possibly some not so good aspects to it. And actually, video feedback approaches tend to be quite effective in that regard. So there's something about videoing the interaction and then supporting a parent to watch that back, that allows the parent somehow to step out of their own perspective on the interaction and view it with fresh eyes. And often, if the right therapeutic kind of support's on offer, that's when parents will realise that actually I'm doing better than I thought with this baby, or oh, I'm not leaving enough space for the baby to talk to me, or oh, actually I'm doing it a lot more like my mum did it than I realised. So I think that that's a really important intervention in terms of supporting the development of insight. It's kind of like when we can provide psychological safety and a new perspective, that's when the magic can happen.
we sometimes use big in the work that we do. And something that I notice is that when the conditions are right and that psychological safety is achieved between you and the family that you're working with, I often talk about locking on and locking out. So when we lock onto this is hard and this is really difficult and everything's going wrong, showing the positives in a big session is a really nice way to start bringing those positives back in. Because when you're locked onto the negative and you've locked out anything good in your relationship, it's so hard to let any glimmers of sunlight in. So starting to see them in a way, I know on the first session sometimes it's like, oh, here I am on screen. But then seeing those beautiful moments, something that we do with ours, obviously we give the families that footage back, but we also take stills and make it into a photo album for families as well. And it just captures that moment. So when you are locked onto the negative, you can quickly just grab something and take me back to a good space.
Yeah, that sounds absolutely lovely. It really does sound lovely. The value of capturing those special positive moments, I don't think can be underestimated. It's a really nice way to practice. There's definitely something about video that parents find hard to disprove. You can say till you're blue in the face, you're doing a good job, or that interaction was lovely, or look how well you were tuned in. But I think parents filter that through years of not believing in themselves or having been criticized or whatever. Whereas when they see it with their own eyes and you can point out in detail how contingent the interaction was or how attuned the interaction was, and point out the baby responding directly to what the parent did, that does wonders for a parent's self-efficacy and just for a sense of hope that they can change little things and really make a big difference for their child. So I think it gives them it really cements as well their engagement in the therapeutic process.
And the impact that they have, the impact that we have on other human beings. I think sometimes we underestimate that what we put out there is just so important.
Yeah, totally.
So Karen, while I've been talking to you, I have had so many light bulb moments, and it always amazes me that in this work, when you speak to someone else with their perspective, it just adds a whole other dimension. That now I'm thinking I need to do more. I've got this kind of internal call to action, and I know that people out there will also be thinking the same, because of course his podcast is coming out during Infant Mental Health Awareness Week. So I wonder if you'd be able to signpost our listeners to where they might be able to find out more.
Sure. So Infant Mental Health Awareness Week runs from the 7th to the 12th of June. There'll be lots of activity on social media, so people can follow the Parent Infant Foundation Twitter account at Parent Infant FDN, and also the First 1001 Days Twitter account. And there'll be loads of podcasts and assets shared and lots of really positive chat using the hashtag IMHAW20, so IMHAW20. So yeah, that would be great if you could let people know about that, and we always love to have lots of interaction and hear about the great work that people are doing in the interests of early intervention. And I just want to say thanks so much for having me, because it's been really great to talk with the two of you and to hear that you are continuing on this really, really important journey around relationship-based work in schools. So yeah, thanks for having me and well done.
Well, thank you so much for being a guest. I've loved listening to you, and in the preparation for this, I've had so much fun and laughter. So thank you so much for sharing your time with us.
Yeah, thanks, Karen. It's really, really wonderful to hear, and kind of, like I say, add another dimension to our journey. So all that's left to say is that we hope you enjoyed this episode. If you would like to subscribe to know more, you can find us on YouTube, Spotify, SoundCloud, and iTunes. So please subscribe if you'd like to know more, and get in touch as well if you've got any questions or any comments that you want to make. We love to hear from you all. So thank you very much.